Welcome to Do Theology, where we keep doctrine in its place.
I'm Ken from Indiana.
And I am Jeremy from Utah.
Your pauses get me every time, I tell you. Today we are playing for you an interview we conducted with Joel and Troy. They are the hosts of the Revived Thoughts podcast. Revived Thoughts seeks to bring sermons from church history back to life, and they're sermons from all different places in church history. It's a fantastic podcast. We encourage you to go find that wherever you get your podcasts and give a listen. But Jeremy actually recorded a sermon for Revived Thoughts that they played just this last week, and it is a sermon from John Wesley. And we had a conversation with Joel and Troy about the Wesleys, John Charles Wesley, particularly their relationship with George Whitefield. So we're excited about this interview to play for you, and then also encourage you once again to listen to the Revived Thoughts podcast.
And this wasn't the first time that one of us was a preacher on the Revived Thoughts podcast. Before, in this sermon, I'm the original Wesleyan, John Wesley. And before, I was the original Calvinist. I played John Calvin a couple of years ago, and you were a Presbyterian.
Yes. I read 2 sermons from J. Gresham Machen.
So, you've done 2 of them. I was thinking it was just 1.
Yep.
Wow, okay. So, yeah, we've done this before, and it's always a fun thing to do, to revive an old sermon. And what we'd like to do before we go to the music into the interview today is we want to play a clip from the most recent sermon that I preached as John Wesley, preaching at George Whitefield's funeral. And it's important to know that John Wesley and George Whitefield were friends, though they disagreed on some theological points. But I want you to hear what John Wesley says in this clip, and I think you can understand how it ties into our podcast. So we're going to go ahead and play that for you, and then we'll jump into the music and into the interview.
First, let us keep close to the grand scriptural doctrines which he everywhere delivered. There are many doctrines of a less essential nature, with regard to which even the sincere children of God are and have been divided for many ages, such is the present weakness of human understanding. In these we may think and let think. We may agree to disagree. But in the meantime, let us hold fast to the essentials of the faith which was once delivered to the saints, in which this champion of God so strongly insisted on at all times and in all places. His fundamental point was, give God all the glory of whatever is good in man, and in the business of salvation set Christ as high and man as low as possible. With this point, he and his friends at Oxford, the original Methodists as they were called, set out. Their grand principle was, there is no power by nature and no merit in man. They insisted that all power to think, speak, or act right is in and from the Spirit of Christ. And all merit is in the blood of Christ. So it is what he and they taught. For there is no power in man until it is given him from above to do even one good work and to speak even one good word, or to form one good desire. For it is not enough to say all men are sick of sin. No, we are all dead in trespasses and sins. It follows that all the children of men are, by nature, children of wrath. We are all guilty before God and liable to death, temporal and eternal.
You don't hear too many Wesleyans preaching like that anymore, do you?
You do not.
So, yeah, even though he said essential and non-essential, 2 terms we don't really like, the idea, of course, is still there, that there are primary doctrines and secondary doctrines. There's a lot more to hear in that sermon. Go check it out at the Revived Thoughts podcast. Subscribe to them, and enjoy this conversation we had with Troy and Joel.
Calvinism is much false doctrine as a woman preacher.
Well, of course, in fundamentalism, you define everything as a gospel issue.
This is a true mark of Christian maturity to discern the difference of issues.
I got an idea. Let's not war with anybody who thinks they got another idea.
There's a lot of different understandings of what the days are in Genesis 1 and to what degree evolution was part of how God created things.
I have disagreements with him in some areas, but those are adiaphora, those are side issues, many important issues.
So many Bible doctrines are ruined when we use the wrong words. This is why it's so critical that we use only the King James Bible.
You gotta have that right or get out of here.
Pray God that I don't take every minor thing and make a major thing out of it.
Nothing divides like truth.
I respect them as brothers in the Lord, with whom I have some strong differences, but they have a big problem with me.
Is there a way that we can work together? I think fundamentally we have to say yes.
Christians can disagree and still kick it.
Well, our guests today are Troy Frazier and Joel Bordes, who are friends of ours and the co-hosts of the Revived Thoughts podcast, members of the Christian podcast community. Welcome, Troy and Joel. How are you today?
Excellent. Thanks for having us.
Doing very good. Happy to be here.
And you are in a very stylish-looking studio with sound panels and dangling light bulbs.
Yeah,
absolutely.
For now, we'll see. We'll see. It's first rendition. It'll probably get remodeled as time goes on, but
oh, it looks great. Way to go, you guys.
Thanks.
And you guys are in Kansas City?
Correct.
Yep, we're in Kansas. And just to help everybody, for those seeing us on screen, this is Troy. So that's my voice.
And I'm Joel, yeah.
That way you can know who's talking a little bit better.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so which one's the handsome one?
Oh, thank you, Troy.
No problem, buddy.
How about that? Look at that. We work great.
Well, for those listening right now who don't know much about the Revived Thoughts podcast, give us the elevator pitch for it, summarize it for us, and let people know how they can connect with you guys.
No problem.
Take it away.
Sure. Most of church history, people would pass sermons back and forth. They'd read them. It was an excellent way to learn about what was going on. Charles Spurgeon famously published a bazillion sermons, and everyone around the world was reading them. But when we created radio, people stopped reading those sermons. They would listen to the great sermons that were on the radio. And throughout time, as we've moved forward, technology has left those old sermons on the bookshelves. But what a mistake we have made, because so much great theology, history, and just good wisdom is in those sermons. You know, we often hear about great theologians like, Charles Spurgeon, Jonathan Edwards, John Calvin, all these great men, but we'd forget that they were preachers first, and how you can live out their great ideas is found in those sermons that they were preaching. And not only that, but it may be kind of crazy, but we have found time and time again that even the sermon that's 1,500 years old is extremely relevant to our lives today, because that truth didn't die.
Yeah, for me, it's more of just the immense amount of material found in this. I mean, we got roughly 1,900 years of church history here that was happening before electricity, before microphones, before we were able to hear their voices themselves. And so the vast majority of what believers were, what Christians were, and what they believed, and how they taught, and how they understood the Bible and their relationship with God is documented in manuscripts. It's not in a podcast form. It's not easy to listen to. And that fascinates me, because we get caught up in these feedback loops, these bubbles of where theologians, where, today's modern preachers kind of have similar views on things. We go through the same world events. We go through the same life events. And so that kind of taints and changes the way that we interpret scripture and our relationship with God in the 21st century. But, someone living through the bubonic plague, or someone living through, the revolution in America, or the Civil War in America, or, the English Civil War, like that, those are very different perspectives, very different points in life. And they see the world differently, and it's intriguing and it's refreshing to hear how past generations walked with God, and encouraging for our walk with God as well. So it's refreshing to kind of get out of the modern feedback loop of what seems to be, and don't get us wrong, Troy and I will say time and time again, we love listening to modern pastors. Our podcast feeds are filled with our favorite churches and our favorite pastors that we love to listen to. But there is something unique about listening to people in different generations.
And just one more thing too, we always give the backstory, Joel and I do, of the preachers, and tell you who this person was, kind of lead you into it before we let you hear the sermon from them, which we've also modernized a bit so it doesn't sound quite as old, maybe a little easier on the ears there. And so just the whole thing comes together really well. We always saw the podcast originally as a sermons podcast, another great preaching podcast, but we've actually been told we're more of a church history podcast in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's something I've really enjoyed about the podcast. Of course, enjoying the sermons. Those sermons are fantastic. And but some of the background information on those sermons really adds a whole new layer to the sermon itself. The sermon is powerful on its own, but then when you guys provide some of that historical background and what was prompting some of these individuals to speak the sermons that they were, it just adds a whole new layer of depth and power to the words that they were speaking.
Definitely.
That's how we feel too. It's when you realize how many times these guys risked their lives or how much suffering they went through, and then they tell you God is still good. Look at all the joy I have. It impacts you differently.
Yeah, that J. Gresham Machen sermon was especially just stunning.
Yeah. Which one? Because we've done 2 of those, so you have to.
I just the one that Ken did. That's the only reason I brought it up.
Ken has done both of our J. Gresham Machen sermons. He's our guy for Machen.
I didn't know there were 2. I thought there was only the one. Very good.
Yeah.
Wow, us faithful listeners of the Revived Thoughts podcast.
Oh, brother.
Yeah. Jeremy, you've read a couple of sermons or at least one sermon, right, for them so far, and got another one coming up.
A pair of Johns.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is one thing that if you name your kid John, you have pretty much a 99% chance they're going to be a preacher at some point.
Yeah, especially if it was anytime in the 1700s, 1800s.
At least half of our catalog seems to be John, Jonathan, Johann, or
variations of John
from France. So there's always a John in there somewhere.
Yeah, and I don't know if we mentioned this or not, but every sermon is read by a different volunteer, a different person. So it kind of changes the pace and tone of the show because it's a different voice, which we like to do. It kind of switches things up, keeps things fresh. If you don't like the reader of one week's sermon, then just wait till the next week and someone else will be reading the next week. So.
Yeah, and also we wanted you to feel like you were hearing that preacher come back to life. And if it was the same voice every week, or especially if it was one of our voices, you wouldn't have felt like you were being transported in time. But you just, the history closes and just this person's voice comes in, and the goal is that just feels like, I'm hearing from J. Gresham Machen, or no, I'm hearing from John Calvin or John Wesley, or whoever it is.
Yeah, it's pretty great. One of the other things about the sermons that you guys have curated is the broad spectrum from people that are they're all over the place in terms of church history, from going way back to almost as early as sermons as we can get, but then also people from very different theological perspectives. Can you speak to that a little bit about how what's your process for selecting a sermon and how that comes together?
Yeah, we really wanted we thought about that a lot. It was like, okay, do we just pick people that agree with us? Do we just pick people from a certain theology? Or even, we're editing the sermons. Do we just kind of clean them up so they all sound really good like we want them to? And of course, we came to the no. We decided not only are we going to do that, but we're going to pick people whose sermons change history, who matter to the church, even if we don't agree with them on a lot of things. As long as we primarily agree on the gospel, we're not going to be bringing people in from other religions or cults. But if we believe in the gospel, we believe in the same Jesus Christ, we read the same Bible, then as much as we can, we're going to give grace to these people we disagree with. We've had Catholic people on. Heck, we had a guy who Jean Gerson gave a very famous, very important sermon, but at the same council he gave that sermon, he was also, agreeing to burn Jean Hus, so you know what I'm saying? Like, these are people who would have wildly disagreed with each other, would have wildly disagreed with probably what we believe. And at the same time, their sermons mattered to the church. They mattered. And we just respect our audience and say, if you don't like this person, if you don't like the backstory, we have to talk about a lot of icky stuff from, heretics, them burning heretics, I should clarify, John Calvin, or uncomfortable racism stuff that these guys get involved with, or maybe they were a part of conquista. All kinds of things happen in their backstories. We talk about it, and then we kind of go, audience, if you don't like this, if you don't think you're comfortable with this, or you listen to the sermon and you don't agree, that we want you to make that decision, not us.
We never want to sugarcoat history or kind of change it or alter it. So it's very much one of those things where we do trust our audience to make a decision. We are very much of the mind that God can use imperfect people to do great things. And so there's definitely, controversy. I mean, quite honestly, once you get a couple hundred years back, it's hard to find anyone that doesn't have controversy, just because you get, and especially with today's theological specificity, is that a terminology?
Sure.
I mean, how do you look at people pre-Reformation? Once you get back before Martin Luther, what theological stance are they coming from and viewing at? That's all stuff that we love to kind of talk about and look at. because it's something that the average person maybe doesn't really think a whole lot about.
And it's funny too, because we do occasionally get pushback. We did have one person who was like, yeah, you had a Johann Thaler on. He's not even a reformer. And we're like, well, we know we said he lived 200 years before the Reformation. Would have been hard for him to be a part of the reformers. But we were surprisingly, what we thought would have been a pretty controversial show. We thought we'd occasionally get, the hate mail and stuff, but everyone seems to understand what we're doing and doesn't seem to have a problem. And 98% of our audience gets it, and they like that. There's we get all the time. It's interesting to hear from people. Would have never went and looked for those people on my own. Don't know that I agree with those people, but it's cool to hear from them all the same.
Has the study of these historical figures, Christian figures, and listening to their sermons and gleaning from what they've taught, has it changed the way you approach, as Troy and Joel, has it changed the way that you guys have approached listening to contemporary preachers that you may or may not agree with? Or has it changed the way you listen to sermons generally now that you've been so involved?
Yes, it kind of has to. Especially for me, I do most of the editing and selecting of the sermons, and I don't know. I noticed that historically, these guys who stood the test of time, they are very bold for the gospel, and they tend to be. There's all kinds of different people. We had poets, scientists, governors of states, and small guys in small backwards churches way out in the middle of nowhere. But the ones that stand the test of time are very bold for the faith, and they tell their audience the truth. They may have very different, Schofield does it very differently than Edwards, does it very differently than Bonhoeffer or Luther or Origen, but they're telling their audience the truth, and they're pointing them back to Christ at the end of the day. And that's something that if you're a preacher, I think you need to ask yourself. Like, I like to think of it this way, as kind of the thought that came into my head as we made the show. I'm like, if I ever preach, will I be able to preach something that 200 years from now would be worth preserving? Or would it just be something that after I preach it, it's forgotten to the sands of time? I think the goal should not be to, miss the audience you're preaching to now, but to preach something so true and accurate of God that people 1,000 years later could read it and still say, no, this is the same God. This is still true today. And one more thing too, though. Whitfield's had a recent sermon that we did called How to Listen to Preachers. And he basically was like, hey, preachers are, they're using messengers of God in the sense that they're bringing God's words to you, and try to give them grace when you can. Try to show them some love. It's not an easy job. It's easy to critique a preacher. It's easy to go after them, but he does say, like, maybe we should also try to remember that, like, these people, they may not even live up to what they're telling you to live up to, but if they are preaching truth, then we need to do to the best we can, give them grace. And I've tried to keep that in my head too. I can be very easy to go, man, I wouldn't have done that, or, oh, I don't like that. And trying to remember what Whitfield says, like, it's a harder job than we think, and keeping in mind that if that person is of God and he's doing his best to bring God's word, I need to give that some grace too, and let that work. Because it's not working in my heart at this moment doesn't mean that message isn't getting to somebody else.
Yeah, I think you answered that great, perfectly.
It reminds me, the first part you were saying about, what if you were preaching, is this worth is this worth bringing back up 200 years from now? I've got a quote on my bulletin board from Doug Wilson that says, "Desperate times call for faithful men and not for careful men. The careful men come later and write the biographies of the faithful men, lauding them for their courage." And I think the Revived Thoughts podcast is a great example of that, as far as you're pointing out in history faithful men. And you're highlighting throughout history how God has used different people in different generations from different backgrounds and totally different contexts to be courageous men. And it's worth praising God over, for sure.
It also really has encouraged, I feel like me, and I think Joel would agree, especially hearing the backstories of these guys. It's easy to, in your moment in time, kind of feel alone, or kind of feel like the world has turned their back on Christianity or the church still, it's so bad today. It's never been so bad. But when you kind of go through history and you get to know so many people who risked their life, so many people who just wouldn't back down and stood before kings, and they gave it to God. They were faithful through it all. You start to feel a lot more comfort, and you go, no, our faith has been tested and tried for 2,000 years. It's not been found wanting. And actually this moment in time maybe isn't the most pleasant, but it certainly has been a lot worse. And we can give praise to God that if it continues to get worse, we maybe will be one of those faithful men in history, sad as it is. But even if we're not, we know that our faith has not failed us yet, and it's been going pretty strong. These guys have done a lot of amazing things, and I think church history, I have realized by studying the show and doing the show just how much I lacked in knowing church history, and I think it's actually a really important aspect of our faith that can really encourage you and give you confidence that what you're doing is real and actually is it can stand the test of time better than we think it can.
Yeah, so you mentioned that sermon from George Whitefield, and George Whitefield is such an interesting person in church history, and one of the small aspects of his life that makes him so interesting is his relationship with the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley. And you guys have a sermon that will be dropping about the same time as this podcast that Jeremy has read from John Wesley, and it's his eulogy or his preaching at Whitefield's funeral. And he says some things in there that are remarkable, especially when we consider the historical relationships between Wesley and Whitefield and how they really had some significant disagreements in their life.
Yeah, didn't get along.
Yeah, to the point where they were, pretty much they were at odds with each other in some things, and yet they were able to come back together and say, you know what, we affirm the gospel together and preserve that unity even in the midst of sharp disagreement on matters of Calvinism and Arminianism.
Mm-hmm. No, it's funny. The sermon really reminds me of like Barnabas and Paul, and that story where Barnabas and Paul split off and they go off and do different things for a while, but we're pretty sure at some point they got back together because Mark is coming and helping Paul, and it seems like they probably reforged that bond. And I feel like this is that eulogy we never got from Barnabas or Paul, or we don't know how that for sure ended, but if we had a eulogy from people who split off and then come back, this is that one. And it's really cool. It's also really cool too because some of the best sermons are these funeral sermons. Some of the best sermons are their final sermons. It's just neat to see John Wesley, who knew George Whitefield even as an enemy, and sometimes knowing somebody as an enemy means you know them better than some of their friends even. But they got it back together, they're friends again, and him giving this final sermon, it's a really cool. You get insights that, quite frankly, you just wouldn't get from their lives without him having that relationship.
Yeah, I've got a biography of Wesley that was written about 50 years after his death, maybe more like 80 or 70 to 80 years after his death. But it says, for a considerable time, Mr. Whitefield continued to labor in connection with the Wesleys, but upon his second visit to America, he imbibed, that's a word we don't use anymore, he imbibed the doctrines termed Calvinistic, and on his return to England, he could not join his old friends in the work of the ministry as before. This diversity of sentiment between these two eminent men soon gave rise to a controversy which was conducted with good temper on both sides, and the result of which was an agreement to differ, retaining their former friendship, and each endeavoring to effect as much good as possible. And it's a great example. There are several good examples, and there are several bad examples in church history, but that's a good example of two men who are able to have good temper about their disagreements. And it seems like today everything is worth splitting over. So it's amazing to be able to go back in church history and to see things like that. Guys that we like to caricature today and say, oh, well, they were totally opposed. And another one is just Calvin and Arminius, the two original guys.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a quote that I have in a biography of Jacob Arminius that says, besides the Bible, there are no greater works on earth than Calvin's Institutes.
Mm-hmm.
Who would say that he ever said that? I mean, no one today even thinks that.
Sure.
Well, and I have a theory, a little bit of a theory that could explain some of this. I think in history we go back and we read a lot of Calvin. It's almost like there's two rails, the subway. Right. There's two rails that don't touch. There's the kind of like the Calvinist side of the church and the Wesleyan side of the church, and these two sides hardly know anything about the other side. Maybe they do, but it seems a lot of times like they won't cross each other too much. So when I get when I get a sermon or something from one of them, I you know what I mean? I'm like surprised. I'm like, oh, I never heard of this cat before. And I'm sure it's kind of an interesting thing there. But what happened was, I feel like a lot of us back in history go and read some of these early Puritan works and some of these early guys, and they're talking about how, Martin Luther and these guys, these Arminians, these free choicers, they're no good. We can't work with them. And we go, yeah, those guys are bad. But we're looking at it from today's perspective, where the theological Arminians are people who, are descendants of the Wesleyans. These guys aren't looking at those guys. These guys are looking at Catholics who are persecuting and buying indulgences, and, they're running pretty much the show in Europe, and they're having to escape to America just to try to get some religious freedom. And they're using a term that now we're turning around and using that same term for a completely different group of people, and using those quotes. It's like, no, these aren't even the same guys by any stretch of the imagination. We're misapplying that term completely.
Yeah, and even within, as I think of Whitefield and Wesley in particular, and their journey, I suppose, we look back and see that kind of the conclusion of it all, and Wesley preached for Whitefield's funeral, and we celebrate that as just as a great thing of church history, where two guys who disagreed with each other greatly and they still managed to get along. But that wasn't always true, even in their life. Like, they had some significant disagreements to where when Whitefield left England for the Americas, and Wesley was preaching in the church that Whitefield had started, which was kind of a more Calvinistic church. And then Wesley gets up and preaches a sermon anti-Calvinism and pro-Arminian, and publishes this paper, which was essentially his sermon, which Free Grace. And just Whitefield felt like he was a big stab in the back. And he was just very hurt by that. And so then when he comes back to England, he returns the favor. He gets invited to speak in Wesley's church and preaches a sermon about Calvinism and how divine election and all this. And so they had this really tense period of life together. But then once they were able to work through some of those things, and their relationship with each other and their common cause for the gospel is really what drew them back together, and brought that relationship to a point where they could say, okay, you know what, we will stand on the most essential things,
right, and
give each other grace in these other areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had not heard that story before. And that's, I don't know, one of the things I love about our show and these types of shows in general is just because I learn so much, probably just from you talking right now, or even when we do research for Revive Thoughts. There's a lot of stuff that I'd never heard of before until I hear it from someone else that knows more, or I read an article or something like that. But it's exciting to just hear little anecdotes like that, little stories like that. I feel like I'm always the last to know. I'm always the last to figure out, but
only because I'm slightly ahead of you by like a couple hours.
Troy, like I said, produces most of our content, so he's usually finding.
But I'm just finding it all, going, oh, cool! Look at this, Joel. We're gonna put this in the show, pretty much.
I grabbed that Arminius commentary. I wanted to find that quote. I'm just gonna have to Google it. But we go way back, the four of us. In one sense, we all went to the same school. We went to Calvary Bible College in Kansas City. And you want to just kind of let people know how you got to this point where you started this podcast? I don't know if you've been given an opportunity on a platform to kind of share that story. You were together at Bible college, you were friends then, and then here years later, you're doing this podcast. And Troy spent time in China. There's been all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah, Troy's been all over the place. Yeah. We came into Calvary at the same time, the same year, and we were pretty good friends from the get-go. I remember that first day during freshman orientation. We got along pretty good. I borrowed a belt from Troy that first semester, and then from then our friendship was solidified, I guess.
That's how every great friendship has begun.
Yeah, I forgot my belt and asked Troy.
And we went to a Bible college with a proper dress code. You couldn't be showing up without a belt. He was like, Troy, I don't have a belt. I was like, I got you, man.
So the friendship was good in there, and we had Troy is very entrepreneurial. He comes up with a lot of great ideas, and we usually pursue a lot of the ideas. We throw away probably more than we pursue, but
Joel's thrown away some winners too. Race to the White House, the board game.
Yeah, he wanted to create a board game at one point.
Oh man,
he was obsessed with starting an ice cream shop at some point.
50% of ice cream shops succeed, so that's a lot higher than your average.
It's good odds, but still, we did not move forward with the ice cream shop. But we've worked on several creative projects over the years, everything from some videos to other podcasts. And Troy's moved around. He's quite the globetrotter.
Yeah, we went from Kansas City to Orlando, worked at an in-home facility with at-risk youth, spent a few months there. Wasn't our favorite. So we left that. Then we went to China, lived north of North Korea, so it was really cold. Then we lived in Hangzhou, and it was south of Shanghai by just a hair, so that was really hot. Then we moved back to Miami, worked at a small Christian school there downtown, and then came back to Kansas City, and just been kind of all over doing different things. Been great. God's been using all these different experiences and just really helped us a lot of things. But in the middle of all that, I just remember Joel and I had a podcast a long time ago. Wasn't great. Could have been better. Had fun, but could have been a lot better.
Oh,
what was it even about? That's a good, good question.
It was I guess just a Christian talk personality show. We would just have different topics that we talk about each year. It was a lot of fun. We'll never say the name of it because we don't want anyone to find it because it
should be off the internet. But on the off chance that it's out there, we don't want nobody knowing that.
So it was more of a podcast for you guys, just to.
It was, and we had a lot of fun with it. But it was a good learning experience.
Sure. We wouldn't be able to do the show we know do now. It would never have gotten to take off or anything if we hadn't had that failure to learn and mess up. But a couple years later, I remember reading a Dietrich Bonhoeffer sermon thinking, wow, this is really cool. I wish I could hear this sermon, especially when I realized the historical context. Pitched it to Joel with a list of ideas. Joel liked that one the most, which was good because that was the one I liked the most. And we kind of ran from it from there. Joel visited me in Miami. We hashed some ideas out. It took a long time. It took about 1.5 years from the formation of us first talking of it to how do we do these? Do we edit these sermons or do we modernize them? Do we leave them in the KJV? Do we read all the sermons? Do we put a historical tidbit? How long is that historical tidbit? What does this show look like fleshed out? We sent people feedback episodes. There was a lot going on, but we really wanted to do this right. And getting those first 10 episodes made when no one really understood what we were trying to ask them to do was very difficult. I was very fresh to editing them. I've never done it before. So it was very hard. It took a while to get that thing going, but once it did and people got the idea, it was able, it got out there really quickly.
And when Troy talks about editing, he's talking about kind of updating a lot of the language terminology that's used in a lot of these sermons, because a lot of them will have an old King James English approach to them, a lot of these and thous.
People
and
from
like
the 1600s apparently were allergic to periods, so they wouldn't put them
just run on sentences all
paragraphs upon paragraphs of semicolons.
Yeah, so the show takes a considerable amount of work from going through what's oftentimes 100 pages of manuscript and condensing that into something that makes sense in a modern conversation as far as just grammar and the terms that we now use, to coordinating, because it's essentially like having a volunteer on every episode because we have a different voice read it, so we have to coordinate and get that recorded and we edit it all together. So there's a lot of behind the scenes that goes on for each individual. It doesn't seem like that when you're just listening to it. It just seems like an
normal episode. 45-minute show. It shouldn't take too long.
Compared to other podcasts, it seems like there's a lot more work that goes into putting an episode together.
Gotcha.
And as soon as I stop talking and then I think of something else to say, but some of the research behind some of these episodes, there's one sermon that we really wanted to get that we had seen pop up in other parts in history. It was being referenced. People were talking about this specific sermon time and time again, but the manuscript itself we couldn't find. And it took us weeks and weeks of trying to dig through old archives, stuff like that, try to find the sermon. And we found out that there was a library in England, in the town that this guy spoke in, that had an old manuscript because the Queen ordered it to be documented, to be recorded. And we thought, hey, let's email them and see, let's see if they'll send us a thing. And sure enough, there was a little transaction fee to get scans of it sent to us. And we were able to record that and put that out. So as far as we know, that is literally the only publicly available variation of that sermon, unless you go to this library in England and look at it for yourself.
And there's a few others like that where we got obscure copies. We have one coming out in the next month that literally I found this book only because this guy had the name of somebody else. I was looking for a guy in India, and this guy was in Australia. And as I was going through, I was like, this isn't the same guy, but really interesting all the same. And his book was available. I copied this sermon. I got somebody to speak it, and I read his biography. And then when I went and go back later on to check on it, Australia pulled that off the publicly available, it's not out there anymore. You can't get this anymore. So this is going to be the only publicly available ever, as far as I can tell, of this sermon when it comes out. And there's just tons of little moments. I had to talk to the David Livingston Foundation to try to get a sermon from them. And like, well, we have this one you can use. I'm like, I'll take it, man. Let's get it out there. So, and then there are a lot of dead ends too, where I've messaged people before. I'm like, hey, does Oliver Cromwell have any sermons? No, he doesn't actually. So good luck with that. So, it doesn't always work out, but it's a lot of fun to try.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now, you guys, have you ever, because we were talking about earlier, you'll get some feedback from people who say, hey, that guy's not even a reformer, or, hey, why are you doing this guy or that guy or whatever? Do you find that people are assuming they know where you're coming from theologically and doctrinally? Because you guys have never really shared what you are theologically, right? Is that intentional? Like, do you want
Yeah, we keep that pretty close to the vest, mostly because we're not theologians. So.
We're not theologians. Yeah,
we're barely history, writers, and so for us, it's like I think it would just distract a little bit from people.
Right.
I think it's better to keep us in the neutral lane so you can just kind of enjoy it, and not worry about it. And we know that we must be doing a pretty good job of it, because from the way people talk to us and when they assume where we're coming from, we've been assumed pretty much everything. So I'm guessing they haven't quite figured us out yet on that one too hard.
That's true.
And we've had people too, they'll message us and they're like, hey, I know I'm not this theological group, but I still like your show. And I'm like, it's fine. The show is supposed to be for all Christians.
For everybody. Yeah.
One of the things that we didn't mean to find in this show that kind of came out of this show was just like realizing, there's a lot of theological differences, but God is using people from all different movements to get people saved and to bring them to the gospel and to change lives. And actually, it's good to have these theology talks. It's good to figure out where we stand. And we want to make sure we're not compromising to the culture or compromising to sin in our own life. But you do not have to think exactly the same to be used by God. Sure. Definitely not.
And let me clarify. I mean, Troy and I do have very specific theological stances. It's not that we don't have views on interpretations of how we believe the Bible is to be interpreted. But as far as the show is concerned, what is a denomination again once you get 500 years in the past, 1,000 years in the past, 1,500? I mean, our earliest sermon is a couple hundred years after Paul died.
It's within 100 years of the lifetime of John. So
right.
A person could have been a baby at the age of John and would have been an old man at the age of Origen, but they would have lived at the same time.
Right. So all of the terminology that we would use in the 21st century to describe, our theological stance mean different things to the church 1,000 years ago. And so it's a different look at theology than we're used to looking at it in the 21st century.
And maybe one last kind of thought to tack on there too, is just like, we do have one criteria, and that is you got to be believing the gospel and you've got to be biblically inerrant. Like you have to believe the word of God is what you're preaching from. Those are the two things where we can't compromise on that. If you're looking at the word of God as just, it's a nice book written by men, we really can't work with you because we're not in the same faith at that point, I don't think.
Now, maybe just kind of wrapping up what you guys are doing personally now in your own personal ministries. Joel, you and I are involved in the same missions organization, and you're doing some cool stuff there. You guys just want to give us like a life update of what you guys do outside of the podcast and what ministry looks like week in and week out?
Yeah, I am a part of a missions organization called Biblical Ministries Worldwide. As a videographer, my wife and I travel and make video content for different ministries and missionaries. And it's something we love to do. We have a passion for filmmaking and communicating how God is working around the world. So that's what I get excited about. And when I'm not recording podcasts with Troy, we're usually editing some project or traveling somewhere to film.
Yeah. I'm a children's pastor and communications pastor at a church here in Kansas City. I love teaching, been doing a lot of work with kids, pretty much my entire career. So I really enjoy the opportunities to do it and to plant those seeds, hopefully see people grow closer to Christ. And when you hear back from parents like, hey, they mentioned your lesson or something during dinner, one of the best feelings you can get. I also, as a communications pastor, run the social media and stuff like that. That part I'm less good at. I don't love being on social media, but it's very important. So I do try to make that time to, connect with people there where I can too. And I'm also a student at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So I take classes online there / on campus there sometimes.
Now everyone knows you're not a Presbyterian. Way to go.
Yeah, they got me
out of the bag.
Actually, though, no, a lot of Presbyterians are actually there too.
Is there really?
Yeah, there's
Are you one of them?
I can neither say nor deny nor anything. It was close. You almost got me. But
Well, Joel and Troy, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. We encourage everyone who's listening to go check out the Revived Thoughts podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. It's there, so go check it out. Go listen to the sermon that Jeremy recorded from John Wesley about recorded at the death of George Whitefield. So thank you so much for hopping on with us.
Thanks for having us on, guys.